Good evening. Today, student protests. 25 years ago on this date, a standoff between the educated young people of China and their government peaked with the massacre in the heart of Beijing. We examine the event and the progress that has been made since. Gone. A tornado tears through Kansas, leaving destruction in its wake. Tonight, 15 are confirmed dead, including 2 children. And the Trump card. Donald Trump announces his intentions to run for United States President in the 2016 election, vowing to bring jobs to America. He makes his first stop on the campaign trail in his hometown of Queens today, Wednesday, June 4th, 2014.
From EJG News, this is a special edition of Your World with Elizabeth Martinez, live from Beijing, China, and Elyse Kaufman, live from Studio 221B in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Hello, I am Elyse Kaufman. Elizabeth is covering a very important story in Beijing. Joining me here in Philadelphia are Grace Extravic and Julianna. We begin today in Beijing, a city of over 20 million people. Today marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Massacre, in which the Chinese government cracked down on student protesters in Tiananmen Square. The notorious massacre exemplified the faults in China's communist government. Grace will explain the roots of the student movement.
Well, Elyse, it began with the death of He Yaobang, the former General Party Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, known for his efforts at creating a more open and democratic Chinese government, in April of 1989. During the period of his command in the 1980s, the heavily communist government saw signs of reform in a more liberal direction, attracting the attention and support of many Chinese citizens, namely the educated young people. On April 18, 1989, following the death of Yaobang 3 days earlier, thousands of mourning students gathered in Tiananmen Square in Beijing to protest communist rule in China. More people joined the protesting masses, participating in hunger strikes and other forms of protest in the square, the government's responses to which became progressively harsher.
So, the people were protesting to change the corruption of the government?
Precisely.
As for the massacre itself, how did that go down?
On June the 4th, troops from the CCP using automatic weapons had advanced in tanks, armored personnel carriers, and trucks from several directions toward Tiananmen Square. Several of our own American reporters were severely beaten by Chinese forces. Troops formed a ring around the square, and a column of tanks and trucks entered from the east. Civilians turned out in massive numbers, protested and fought for 7 hours to prevent the troops from advancing. In the face of the overwhelming numbers of heavily armed forces, thousands of civilians stood their ground or swarmed around military vehicles. Armored personnel carriers were set on fire, and demonstrators assailed troops, throwing rocks, bottles, and any other materials they could find. Troops shot at random into crowds of unarmed civilians with automatic weapons, and a large number of destroyed military vehicles littered the Beijing streets. It was reported that an undisclosed entity had secured a university campus where students had captured an armored personnel carrier, and a warning was issued that executions of students would begin that night. The number of people who died in the massacre is unknown, with the relatively small number given by the Chinese government publicly being regarded as incorrect.
Yes, and I guess this popular footage is what most people now know about the incident.
The man, now known as Tank Man, was then carried out of the way into the crowd by 2 figures in blue attire that have not been officially identified. He became a symbol of the protest due to the videos and photographs of the incident spread internationally via the media. Some have identified the man as Wang Weilin, a 19-year-old student, but the name has been denied by the CCP, and a nominal amount of information is officially known about the man or what happened after his historic confrontation.
But what happened after the event? How has it impacted China today? Over to Liz in Beijing for more details on that. Liz?
Hi, Elyse. To this day, the Chinese government denies the occurrence of the Tiananmen Square massacre. The government censors the internet search engine, so if a Chinese citizen were to look up an illegal term, the government would shut down their connection to the browser for a period of time. If someone were to look up the Tiananmen Square massacre, their Chinese search engines would find only an article or 2 explaining the source of the myth that was called the Tiananmen Square massacre. An image search of Tiananmen Square displays joyful images such as Tiananmen Tower, the monument to the people's heroes, blooming flowers, or recent events in the square, whereas the same term searched in an American browser would yield the famous images of Tankman or the destruction of that day in 1989. Taken directly from a China Daily News article entitled Tiananmen Massacre a Myth, written by Gregory Clark, a former Australian diplomat who specializes in Chinese affairs, on 7/14/2011. The fact is that for 7 weeks, the Beijing government had tolerated a student protest occupation of its iconic central square despite the disruption. Some then leaders even tried to negotiate compromises, which some of the student leaders later regretted having rejected. When eventually troops were sent in to clear the square, the demonstrations were already ending, but by this time the Western media were there in force, keen to grab any story they could. Ironically, the Western media, which barely noticed the massacres in certain countries, go out of their way to paint a false picture of a brutal Chinese government willing to march in a massacre its protesting students in the hundreds, if not thousands. Tiananmen remains the classic example of the shallowness and bias in most Western media reporting and of government black information operations seeking to control those media. China is too important to be a victim of this nonsense.
Thank you, Liz. Wow, it's fascinating to see how restrictive the government of China still is.
I agree.
In many ways, it seems, Chinese citizens are still faced with a secretive government against which they protested 25 years ago today. Up next, a tornado tears through Kansas, leaving a path of destruction. We'll be right back after this commercial break.